tonight's actually a lovely, wonderful big night. Aside from just getting ready for Passover, it's also the 5th anniversary of HerTorah. 4 years ago, I sat at Aliza Sperling's kitchen table and listened to her dream out loud of bringing together Jewish women from across the greater DC area to learn Torah with each other. And a few weeks later, I watched Aliza introduce 100-something women to HerTorah and to Rachel Sharansky Danziger, who was our very first HerTorah educator. Aliza shared her beautiful vision of community built through Jewish learning, through connection and curiosity, diversity, compassionate listening, and generous sharing. And then we had the privilege of listening to Rachel Danziger teach. And she taught what it was like to grow up as the daughter of a famous prisoner in exile who was then later freed. And she told us what it was like to hear her parents, Natan and Avital Sharansky, tell their story year after year around her Passover Seder table. And Rachel, who herself is a scholar of literature and history, taught us about the art of storytelling and the importance of telling our stories and the significance of having our stories heard and then retold by others. I didn't know it then, but Rachel was setting the stage for what HerTorah has become, a space of sharing and listening and gifting one's story to others, a space where women's stories are cherished as the oral Torah that they truly are. And for the past 4 years, each of the women who has showed up for our Passover HerTorah gatherings has shared a little piece of her story, her wisdom, her strength, her journey, everything. And for those past 4 years, I've brought each one of you to my Seder table. And I've retold your stories of perseverance and struggle and humor and wonder. Your stories fill my table, and they have become part of my magid, my retelling of our communal story. And I learned so much from each one. So this is a sincere thank you to each one of you. A thank you to Aliza for being such a powerful table setter and inviting each of us to pull up our chairs so close and share our stories with each other. And I'm grateful to each of our teachers tonight who have come to share some of their stories as well. I want to thank our partners for this gathering, Hayes, Midbar, Pardes, and Supergirl. You'll see links to their websites in the chat, and we'll talk more about them later. We're going to talk a lot tonight about our collective Seder tables, and I just want to acknowledge many of us who might have small Seder tables this year. I remember clearly a very dear friend remarking before Pesach in 2020, when all of us were in quarantine for our Seders and in shock. And she said, "This is awful, but I'm kind of glad that everyone now understands what my tiny Seder table feels like every year, not just this pandemic year." So just a reminder to all of us that we all know what small Seder tables feel like, and perhaps we can think of someone to invite to our Seder table this year, or at least sensitively acknowledge that not everyone is having a big Seder experience this year. Also, tonight's learning is sponsored in memory of Orly Chaim Bat Sarah Yitzchak. Now I get to introduce the amazing Rabbanit Aliza Sperling, the director and visionary behind all of HerTorah. Thank her for 4 beautiful years of creating these amazing years of rooms of learning and connection. Here is, God willing, to many, many more to come. You'll see her bio in the chat.
Thank you so much, Ariella, and hello, everybody. It's so wonderful to see you. Thank you, Ariella. This morning, very early in the morning, I was thinking to myself, it can't really be 4 years since we started. So I just kept like adding up the years, and it kept coming out to 4 years. So as everybody who knows Ariella knows, she is the powerhouse behind everything, and she gives credit to everybody else. So Ariella, thank you for your vision and your leadership. And oh no, I see myself way too big. Hold on. And I'm so happy to have been on this journey with you. I've been doing some preparation for Passover, and actually one of the ways that I've been prepping is by reading this book. I don't know if you have seen it or read it, but like half the things in my house, it was a gift from Ariella, and it's called The Art of Gathering: How We Meet and Why It Matters. And it's such an amazing book because it really gets you to think about how what's the purpose of the gathering, and how are we going to craft gatherings? And that's really what we do on Seder night. So one of the questions that Priya Parker, who's the author of this book, asks is, she says, you've got to decide why you're really gathering. If you want to gather people together, you have to know what your purpose is. Usually at HerTorah, our purpose for gathering, I wrote down a few reasons why we gather. We gather because we want to bring Jewish women from lots of different backgrounds together in community to learn from each other. We gather because we believe that women's lived life experience is an important part of a Torah conversation. We want to experiment with building new communities that are supportive and disregard lines that traditional Jewish communities might draw based on denomination or age or geography or income level. And we want to promote women's Torah. We think it's really great. Those are some of the reasons why we gather. But pre-Passover, we had to think about another element, and that is, I know that, a lot of times we gather because everybody here wants to learn something new. But before Passover, I think a lot of us not only want to learn something new, but we want to take what we're learning and be able to translate it and bring it to whatever Seder table we're at. And that's a new purpose that we have before Passover. And so I want to be really attentive and think about how can we help you do that as well. So tonight's goal is not only lilmod, to learn, but also lilamed, to figure out how to translate and teach what we're learning together. Tonight we're talking about freedom. Does Passover just commemorate what God did for us? Or does it also commemorate some of the spiritual work that we did back then to free ourselves or to be able to be freed? And can we learn from that spiritual work of freedom how to free ourselves today and what it means to be free? We have three fantastic educators that we're going to learn from today. And they each really went through a lot to be here. So I'm going to pick them. It's almost like a competition of who went through more. Rabba Shani Gross is going to talk to us about Miriam. Jory Hanselman Mayschak is going to talk to us about speech and about how speaking can be a way of freedom. And Rabbi Sarah Bassin is going to talk about the responsibilities of freedom. And right, because many of us are going to want to think about how to bring this into our Seders, I encourage you, first of all, if you've got a pen and paper next to you, if you hear something that you think, okay, I want to bring to my Seder, write it down. Because if you're like me, you'll be like, later you'll think, I knew there was something there that I wanted to bring, but I just don't remember. I'm going to talk, after each of our teachers teaches us, I'm going to talk to them a little bit about how they think we can integrate it into our Seders. And then at the end, all of us together are going to kind of brainstorm what we might do with what we've learned tonight. Okay, so I think that's it. I think we're ready to jump in. Our first teacher tonight is the fabulous and amazing Rabba Shani Gross, who not only is an amazing teacher, but braved a storm and a power outage for over 24 hours to be with us tonight. So thank you so much. You can see her bio in the chat. She is the Director of Education at Pardes North America. And I also asked each of our teachers tonight what is one Passover ritual that they want to share with us. And Rabba Shani said that since she is Persian, what her family does is they dress in Persian clothes, they do their Seder on the floor on mattresses, and they have a lot of little appetizers for the karpas. So Rabba Shani, I know we all just want to ask you about the appetizers, but we also want to learn about Miriam. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. I want to believe that nothing would have stopped me from coming. So Baruch Hashem, it all worked out and the power turned on just in time. We're going to look at a character in this brief time together who only recently has been invited to the Seder table. And I think hopefully by the end of this, we're going to learn why she really deserves her place there. I want to credit this class. I spent a lot of time with Miriam Hanivia, Miriam the prophetess, who we're going to learn about the past 2 years. I was learning about Miriam, who is on the traditional page, very much a side character. But what you start to learn when you pull back the layers is beneath the traditional page is this rich revisionist narrative of what is going on in our Exodus story, and specifically the beginning of the formation of the Israelite nation. And I just want to credit the women I learned with, given that this is a space full of amazing women. Let's bring a few more in. Adina Paulin, Naama Sadan, Maharat Victoria Sutton, and Efrat Landau. So I just wanted to bring those names in and honor those friends of mine. So what we're going to do is we're going to quickly re-examine the traditional original story and unearth a new story that the rabbis imagine or weave about Miriam that's really quite unexpected. So I'm going to quickly just share my screen and we're going to dive right in. So thankfully, Miriam's story begins, her own origin story begins with the story of our Seder, of our Exodus story. We see a very vague few verses. We're told that, and I'm going to just read in the English for the sake of time, a man from the house of Levi went and took a woman of Levi. The woman conceived and bore a son, and she saw how beautiful he was, and she hid him for 3 months. This is after Pharaoh declares that all boys have to be thrown into the Nile. And after she can no longer hide him, she creates a wicker basket. This is our famous story. And she puts him into the basket and puts him by the Nile. And then we're told this little verse, and his sister stationed herself at a distance to learn what would befall him. Now, there's a few reasons why this is a really interesting piece of text. Number one, you'll just notice that nobody gets a name. There's a man, there's a woman, and there's a sister. We're not told anyone's names. And I'm curious if folks in the chat can just share, why might someone, what might it signal for someone to not be named in a story? Okay, I see someone just wrote, Ariel, that perhaps they're not important. If they're not named, or we can all connect with them, right? This was everyone's story. We're going to generalize. It's not about that specific person. This is all of our stories. That they are female. Interesting. Rena writes, right, that again, this is generalizable. They're not the only ones to do this. Eve wrote, every man, every woman, every sister. This is really a collective story. Right, the story itself, Jessica Litwack says, the story itself is more important than the characters. Beautiful. Beautiful. So, and one thing I'll just share is, if you read the text, if you continue and open your Tanachim, you open your Bible, you'll see that the only one named actually is Moses. In this entire chapter, only Moses deserves a name. Another perhaps an effort on the behalf of the text to say, here, focus your attention here. We're going to follow this person's story. But what's fascinating is that the rabbis of the Midrash, a commentary on this Torah that is beautiful, and so, as opposed to in the Talmud, we see the rabbis really spend a lot of time talking about legal theory. Here, their creativity as interpreters just is magical. So we're going to get to look at two reinterpretations on this text that expand our understanding of these characters, and in particular are trying to answer the question, why is it that the sister stays to watch the child, and why don't this child's parents stay, right? The mother goes through all this effort to create a basket for her child, to put the baby in the Nile, and yet then she disappears. Why? What is going on? Okay, for the sake of time, I'm going to read, but then I'm gonna pause and we're gonna unpack together. Okay, this midrash, this first commentary, rabbinic commentary, is coming after commenting on a verse from the first chapter of Exodus. They're going to tell us a very interesting story that impacts this one. We're told that Miriam was also called Pua. Why? Because she would raise her face, Hofia Panim, against her father, Keneged Aviha. Why? And I'm going to read in the English. When Pharaoh ordered the Israelite boys to be cast in the Nile, Amram, who was the head of the Sanhedrin, the court, the Jewish court at the time, the Israelite court, said, "Shall an Israelite give birth for nothing?" Right. So he sees Pharaoh is declaring that baby should be thrown in the Nile, and very logically says, why should we even bother giving birth if we're dooming our death? Oh, was I muted? Okay, great. He immediately separated himself from Yocheved, which is his wife, namely the woman from Levi, and divorced her, though she was already 3 months pregnant. When the Israelites saw what Amram did, they divorced all their wives. Now, quick question, and feel free to use your handy dandy Zoom chat hand, or is it Zoom hand rather? What is strange about what Amram chooses to do? Where does the logic begin to fall apart? Ah, Jessica, she's already pregnant. So he separates from her in order to avoid, theoretically, creating any more children to meet this fate. But this baby is already on its way. Anyone else? What might that tell us about this decision? Steph, sounds like a trauma response. That was made out of fear. Okay, good. We have a nice machloket happening. We have a nice disagreement. On the one hand, perhaps this is a trauma response. Perhaps this is out of fear. Maybe he didn't know she was pregnant. Maybe he's a role model for others. Maybe he understands, maybe it's not relevant for him, but he has to make the necessary step in order to impact those who follow him, the leader. Okay, so we're going to see, how does Miriam respond? Okay, how does Miriam respond? Amar lo bito, gezeratcha kasha mishel Paro. She says to him, "Father, your decree is harsher than that of Pharaoh. He only decreed against the males, but you have decreed against both the males and females alike. Besides, Pharaoh being wicked, there is some doubt that his decree will not be fulfilled, but you are righteous, your decree will undoubtedly be fulfilled." And what happens? Immediately, Amram takes back his wife, and all the Israelites take back their wives.
The rabbi.
Okay. I'm seeing in the chat, right, there's fear. Again, troubling that the only worthy aspect of marriage is procreation. Fair enough. This is obviously a very different time. Although they're not saying, right, yes. Yes. Okay, beautiful. Now, some of you may have heard this midrash before, but what I hope is that the next midrash we're going to look at, in this first midrash, we saw Miriam stand up to her father, right? She's able to imagine and see what is the present, right? Marilyn writes, it's admirable that he listens to his little daughter. Absolutely, right? And what's fascinating is that when you look at the text itself, it is the women, it is the daughters that actually do end up saving this child. Because it is this daughter, Miriam, and Bat Paro, the daughter of Paro, who are ultimately the ones to save this child. So in many ways, this critique by Miriam is very much, in some way, one could argue, a prophetic voice to what is actually happening of the present moment, right? You already have a child on the way. You cannot escape this. This is not the way to make change. We have to think of a new approach. And even perhaps that the daughters themselves might be the ones to help save the day. And therefore, we are all of Exodus to Miriam. Just you wait, Steph. Okay, we're going to continue to our last midrash. We have from Shemot Rabbah, again the same part of the midrash, this commentary. And this text was relatively new for me. I hope it's exciting for you. Okay. Why is it that Miriam is the one that waits and not her mother? Okay, and this is a really incredible text. I'm going to start reading in the English. And his sister stationed herself at a distance. Why did Miriam station herself at a distance? Rav Amram, in the name of Rav, said, because Miriam prophesied. Okay, she had mitnabet, she had a nivuah, she had a prophecy. What was it? And now, we should just take a moment to marvel at this idea that already the rabbis give Miriam, on the page, there's no nivuah, there's no prophecy, and yet the rabbis feed her one in this text. Okay, what do they say? She says, my mother is destined to give birth to a son who will save Israel. And when the house was flooded with light at the birth of Moses, her father arose and kissed her head and said, my daughter, your prophecy has been fulfilled. This is the meaning of why Miriam is called the prophetess, because we later in the book of Exodus, because in the text itself, we never see her have a prophecy. And this is where the rabbis feed in a prophecy. Okay. I see there's a whole conversation in the chat about divorce and not divorce. I'm going to let that go on its own. We're going to focus here on this text. All right. Now this is where it gets interesting. Her father kisses her on the head. She has this prophecy, right? And in some way, you can even imagine it's the continuation of that first story, of that first midrash, where she convinces her father to stay with her mother. And not only is he going to stay with her mother, she says, this child is important. Don't give up on this child. This child is going to matter. Then this child is born. She gets kissed on the head. She's praised. She's a prophet. She's amazing. And what happens? What does her mother do? Now that she was casting him into the river, right? V'kevan shehetiluhu leyor, amda ima v'tavchala al rosha. Now that she was casting him into the river, her mother strikes her on her head and says, V'hechan nevuatech? Where's that prophecy? I'm curious, how do you read what if you had to imagine what was her mother thinking in that moment? What is happening for her mother? And you can feel free to put your answer in the chat. Heartbreak, loss of false hope. Thank you, Magida. Marilyn, she's blaming the messenger. Rabbi Sarah Bassin, she's sending her child away so as not to watch him die, but believing he will. She sounds bitter. She hid the baby for 3 months thinking this would get better, but it didn't. Right? Maybe she's even making fun of her daughter, but she's sad and angry. She's blaming and sad, right? Here is this baby that you promised me, right? You told me this nevuah, that this baby was worthwhile, right? We can even imagine maybe some of the other difficult choices Yocheved may have considered, perhaps to not have this child, and how many women perhaps made that difficult choice. Right? Right. I have often wondered if it wasn't uncommon to send a baby down the river. It's an excellent question, given how the daughter of Pharaoh, when she sees this baby, seems to know immediately that this is an Israelite child. So it's perhaps. Right. The mother was despairing, but the daughter had hope. Now, this is what's fascinating. Okay. Right. Where is your prophecy? She smacks her on the head. And this is why it says, and his sister stationed herself at a distance to know what would be the outcome of her prophecy. So what we see is in both of these stories, right, going back to our original text, according to the rabbis, this is not just a story about perhaps a typical story, a story that perhaps happened to so many Israelites. What's unique about this story at a distance, so she wouldn't get hit on the head again, although not at a distance from her mother, at a distance in the Nile itself, presumably, but that's an interesting read. I like that. She is able, unlike her parents, her father, after verse 1, disappears, perhaps like the Midrash is suggesting, because he gave up. He gave up while the baby was already in the womb. The father gives up, and then the mother holds on to hope, holds on to this difficult, challenging, impossible vision, and then she too gives up. It's too hard to bear this vision. It is the daughter, it is this next generation that is able to imagine a new reality, both for the future and for the present. And what's fascinating about Miriam, according to these rabbis, is that she not only has a prophecy, but she goes and makes that prophecy into a reality. She is the one, she stations herself at a distance. And the text goes on and she maneuvers about Pharaoh, the daughter of Pharaoh, and it is ultimately her ability to see in a different way, to imagine new possibilities, right? She uses the little agencies she has. And it is because of her that, because of her choice too, as this gathering is all about, choose freedom, to imagine a reality in which freedom could even be an option, which I think ultimately is why Miriam deserves to be at our Pesach table, because without Miriam, without this dream, without this prophecy, without this vision, we wouldn't be here. None of this would have happened. Okay, I think that was 20 minutes on the dot. I'm gonna stop here and pass it back to Aliza.
Rabba Shani, thank you so much. I love this vision of Miriam because it's a vision of somebody who experiences freedom or chooses freedom even during a time of slavery and even during a time of oppression, which is so beautiful. And I was wondering how you think we can take these gorgeous concepts, because I don't know about your Seder, but in my Seder, I'm not sure everybody's going to want to do a 20-minute text study. So I'm wondering how we can take some of these concepts and bring them to our Seder.
Beautiful. So first of all, if you don't have a cup for Miriam, now's the time. Just on a very tachlis note. But something I think about a lot is that Pesach is also considered, certainly according to the biblical text, as the original New Year of the Jewish people. And one of the things that we do maybe in the more general New Year is we sort of have aspirations for ourselves. And so something that I'm going to be bringing a question inspired by Miriam is, what feels impossible for me right now, and what might I allow myself, what could happen if I imagine a different reality? So, just a practical example, maybe for myself, and I don't want to speak for others, I have very small children, and Shabbat dinner is not always as magical and wonderful and spiritual as I would like to have imagined. What would happen if I took a moment to both not only imagine a reality, but then took at least 1 or 2 steps to make a change? And I've certainly had my moments where I've given up, but I'm trying to bring the spirit of Miriam with me, whether it's at the Seder itself. Maybe will we even get through a quarter of the Seder with my kids before someone loses it? Maybe not. That's so I don't know if that is exactly what you were looking for, but it's something I'm thinking about.
I think that's amazing. I was also thinking along those lines that you were talking about the generational divide, and sometimes one generation can't see something, but the next generation can. So much of a Seder is the older generation telling the younger generation. And one thing I'm thinking about based on what you just taught us is if we can actually say to the younger generation at our Seder tables, if there is one, this is a problem we can't solve, we're really wrestling with, but maybe you've got some ideas for us. Maybe you've got a perspective that, could help us out. So thank you, Rabba Shani. I'm so happy your power is on.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, so at the end, we are going to all kind of brainstorm together what we want to take back to our Seder tables. But right now I want to introduce you to our next wonderful teacher, Jory Hanselman Mayschak, who is from Bamidbar Wilderness Therapy. And Jory, I'm so happy that you're here. I feel like this question of what it means to speak and the connection between speech and freedom is so important, and one that you really have unique expertise on. You can see Jory's bio in the chat. Just to add to that, one of Jory's favorite Passover traditions is jalapeno poppers with matzah meal as her maror, her bitter herbs. So if you're interested, you could ask her about that later. Jory, thanks so much for being here with us.
Thank you. I'm really excited for this conversation and learning tonight. Really appreciate the opportunity. So we're going to be diving into the power of stories for the next 20 minutes. And a story can be told in a million different ways. There's so much power in the narratives we choose to tell. And that's both the narratives we tell others, but even more so, the narrative we tell ourselves. And that's what I really want to dig into with everyone tonight. So I want to have us start by going inside for a moment. And I'm going to invite you, if you feel comfortable, to close your eyes. You can put your hand over your heart if that feels good. And take a deep breath to center yourself here in this moment. I want to take us to SVIVAH's beautiful framing for this evening. So they shared, kind of in putting the event together, that the Passover narrative is not about God saving us, but the story and ritual teach us that freedom involves work on our end. We play an important role in achieving and maintaining freedom. So I want you to envision in your mind, what does it mean to free yourself? I'm not asking what you're freeing yourself from, but really, what does it mean for you to be the one who's doing the freeing? I want you to picture it. So what does it look like? What does it feel like? What does it sound like? And if you were to tell that story, what would that story be? And I invite you in the chat to share a word or two to capture what just came up for you. Kind of envisioning the story you tell when you think about freeing yourself, 1 or 2 words that captures what came up for you in that. See someone put down disability rights, removing the binds, no self-doubt. I love that. Lightness, no stress, powerful, no blame. Abortion access for all, joy. Quiet, taking sick days, being true to myself. Release, kindness. Amazing. Thank you. So when I think about this story for me, it's not just one story. We don't just become free once, but freedom is a journey. And it's a journey that takes our active participation. And in Jewish tradition, the journey of freedom is a journey in and to and through the wilderness. And we're going to dive into that tonight. So I'm going to throw a text sheet in the chat. We are not going to kind of look at these word for word, but I'm going to refer to some of these texts, and they're there for you if you want to dig deeper into the full text. So Bamidbar, the 4th book of the Torah, also known as Numbers, is a story of our journey through the wilderness. And our tradition tells us that we spent 40 years in that wilderness. In Hebrew, the word midbar translates as wilderness, but the word itself comes from the Hebrew root for the word daber, which means to speak. So what's the connection between speech and our journey through the wilderness after leaving Egypt? The Zohar, which is, I have a text from the Zohar as that first source there. It's a foundational work in the literature of Jewish mysticism and shares commentary on mystical aspects of the Torah. And it introduces this idea of galut hadibor, the exile of the word. So the Zohar tells us that while Moses was in Egypt, his lips were circumcised, is the language they use. His lips were impeded and his words were exiled. He had no speech. And he wasn't able to put words to speech until leaving Egypt and journeying through the wilderness to reach Mount Sinai. So I'm curious, and you can put this in the chat, what do you think it means that Moses's words were in exile? What does that mean that Moses's words were in exile? So I see a disability such as a stutter. There is no one to listen to him. I love that. Awesome. So when I look at this, I interpret it to mean that kind of when we were in Egypt, we lost our ability to tell our own stories. During that time, we weren't only physical slaves, but we were also slaves to another person's narrative. So when we left Egypt, we spent 40 years in the Midbar, in the wilderness, and it was there that we really regained our ability to speak and took ownership over our own personal narrative instead of feeling slaves to another's narrative. I want to talk about what it means to own our narrative. And in particular, I want to make a connection between owning our narrative, personal freedom, and mental health. So I come today to you as a passionate advocate for mental health, as the co-founder and CEO of Bamidbar, which is an organization dedicated to youth and young adult mental health in the Jewish community. And a huge part of our philosophy rests on this belief that a part of how we support young people in building mental health is in supporting them in feeling agency and owning their own narrative. And I deeply believe that Judaism can be really robustly supportive of our mental health and well-being. And part of how it is supportive is in helping us find our voice and find our agency and tell a redemptive narrative of freedom and self-liberation. So I want to take a couple of minutes to share my own story, because my own story is deeply tied to this story of freedom and self-liberation. And it feels hard to talk about it, particularly going into Passover, without sharing a little bit of myself in this space. And I want to name that, like, this is a little vulnerable for me to share about myself in a room of many people that I don't know. And so thank you for kind of accepting my full self as I share my story. So when I was in high school, my life was really deeply impacted by mental illness. One of my siblings deeply struggled with mental illness and substance use disorder. And in a really short period of time, I lost 2 close friends to suicide, unfortunately. And when I was 15, I was lost and I was afraid and I was self-destructive and struggling with depression. And in April, just before Passover, my parents enrolled me in a wilderness therapy program. And at 15, I left my parents' home, a land I knew and I was familiar with, and I entered into this unknown wilderness. And for 2 months, I wandered that wilderness. I learned to build a fire without matches or a lighter. I made a backpack out of wood and leather. I cooked over an open fire with 8 other young women who were also struggling. I slept in the rain and the snow, and I wrestled with kind of deep internal brokenness and a sense of displacement that I really felt defined me. All of these things had happened in my life that I just couldn't grapple with, and I felt they were who I was. But in this environment, surrounded by the beauty and the austerity of the wilderness, I began to appreciate that kind of my pain and my own unanswered questions didn't make me weak. They were an essential part of who I was and who I am. They are what defined me, but not in the way that I had thought. When I was 15, I wandered through the wilderness, through the Midbar. And while the program I was in wasn't Jewish, my identity as a Jew was really fundamental to what I gained from that program. I was in that program over Passover, and the connections were really too blatant to ignore. So Mitzrayim, Egypt, means the narrow place. In each generation, we're supposed to celebrate our liberation from Mitzrayim. We were slaves, but now we are free. And in every generation, we are bound. We're held back by external events or internal beliefs. It might be by depression, trauma, addiction, immobilizing self-doubt, or fear of the unknown. And every year, we have this opportunity to explore those things that hold us back, to explore our personal Mitzrayim and say, no, I will not let this stop me from living my life to its full potential, from living the life I want to lead. So as I was in that place, as I was struggling with the death of close friends and the fear of losing a loved one and my own depression, and as I celebrated Passover alone in the wilderness, kind of away from the family and everything that I knew, that concept of self-liberation from Mitzrayim really profoundly impacted my journey and experience. So Viktor Frankl said that when we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. And that's what I learned on that journey through the wilderness. I think we can all relate. Life sucks sometimes. It really does. I'm sure everyone can agree to that. We don't always get to choose what happens to us, but we get to choose the story we tell, and we get to choose the story we believe. And sometimes it takes telling the story to also believe it. So I want to make those connections between how does owning our story support our personal freedom and our mental health, and want to say that it's not just me that's saying owning our narrative leads to greater freedom and strengthened mental health. There's a large body of research that suggests that there's a connection between the story of our lives, our narrative identity, and our mental health. And crafting these stories provides us with a sense of unity and purpose. And the research shows that the way we approach that storytelling actually has an impact on our psychological well-being. So if you go to source 3, I have some information from a story from a journal, from an article from the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, which was published in 2015. It was a study that looked at participants who shared stories of their lives in semi-structured interviews, and then they were followed for 6 years with different physical and mental health measures. And the research showed that certain ways of telling our lives stories were associated with different trajectories around mental health. In particular, there were 3 narrative themes that were related to positive mental health outcomes. And I have those 3 themes on that source sheet. So the first theme is agency. When people made sense of their lives with a sense that they were in the driver's seat, as opposed to being batted around at the whims of external forces, they experienced positive trajectories of mental health in the following years. So number 1 theme that they saw was agency in how we tell our stories. Number 2 was communion. When people described their lives as marked by connections with close others, they experienced positive trends in their mental health in the following years. And then number 3 was redemption. When people's stories about difficult or challenging experiences included a shift in emotional tone towards some positivity, insight, or lesson they drew from the experience, they showed positive trajectories of mental health in the following years. So I'm curious to see in the chat, where do you see agency, communion, and redemption in the Passover narrative? Where do those show up? We've already talked about Miriam having agency, absolutely. People of Israel. Agency when we cry out to God. Ooh, we're going to get into this in our next text. So someone put down the Jewish people couldn't imagine being freed at first, but then they took action. We're going to talk about that in a second. Agency when we connect with God. Communion, the women dancing. Moses reconnects the people to God. Agency, changing identity while in the wilderness. The children asking why we do what we do. I would also name like making space for different children and recognizing like that difference is important. Every person with their own narrative can show up. Agency when we connect to each other. Amazing. So story about freedom, redemption. Yeah. So in some ways it's a hard question to ask because everything in the Passover narrative, I think, is agency, communion or connection, and redemption. Like that is the story in a nutshell. Nachshon. So we're going to get into Nachshon. So thank you for that great segue, whoever put that down. So I want to close by sharing 2 different texts, one story and one poem. So there's this really beautiful midrash. The midrash is a compilation of stories in the Talmud about biblical texts. And this midrash is about the Jews at the edge of the Red Sea. So in the Passover narrative, after the 10 plagues have rained down on the Egyptians, Pharaoh has agreed to let the Israelites go. They packed up, they moved out, they're standing on the banks of the Red Sea when Pharaoh has this change of heart. There's no way forward, there's no way back. And if the Israelites are unable to push through in this moment, they're going to be in really big trouble. So this midrash tells us that at this moment, and if Moses prays to God, the Egyptians are coming down behind them, the people are trapped, they're afraid, they're saying like, what, there weren't enough graves in Egypt that you took us to die in the desert? Like, why are we here? We should have just stayed where we were. I don't want to be free if this is what freedom looks like. And Moses is praying and nothing is happening. And then this individual, Nachshon ben Aminadav, kind of charges into the water. He doesn't know how to swim, the stories tell, but he goes forward. And I always imagine kind of him saying in this moment, I don't know where I'm going, but I know I can't stay here. Like that's always, when I think of Nachshon, like that's his language in that moment. It's like, the future is unknown, it's big, it's scary, like, but where I am isn't working and something's got to change. And I'm going to take action to make that change. So in this moment, Nachshon is practicing agency. And it's only when Nachshon kind of trusts in his own ability to create the outcome that he sought, that's when we're able to really affect change. And when we see the sea splitting and when the people are able to kind of travel forth on dry land to escape to freedom. And in the Midrash, it says that God speaks down to Moses and says, like, my people are drowning and you're praying? What are you doing? And Moses responds like, I don't have any power. Like, what else can I do? There's nothing in my power. And God says, speak to them. There's a time for prayer and a time for action. Like, you prayed, but Nachshon took action. Like, you could have told them to go forward. And because Nachshon took that action, that's why the sea split. We need to practice that personal agency to begin our journey toward freedom. So the last text I want to share is a poem by Mary Oliver that is called The Journey, that I think really speaks to this as well. And you can see this on the source sheet as well, the last source, if it's helpful to read along rather than listening, because I'm going to read the full poem because I think it's really beautiful. So The Journey by Mary Oliver. One day you finally knew what you had to do and began. Though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice, though the whole house began to tremble, and you felt the old tug at your ankles. Mend my life, each voice cried, but you didn't stop. You knew what you had to do. Though the wind pried with its stiff fingers at the very foundations, though their melancholy was terrible, it was already late enough in a wild night and the road full of fallen branches and stone. But little by little, as you left their voices behind, the stars began to burn. Through the sheets of clouds, there was a new voice, which you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save. So a last question for everyone is just, how will you bring your voice to your Seder this year? And I guess that'll get into our conversation with Aliza, but want to ask you in the chat, how do you plan to bring your voice to the Seder this year?
Jory, while people are answering here in the chat, from a mental health perspective, you know, a lot of times it's hard to bring your voice to the Seder. There are a lot of family dynamics if you're at a family Seder, or you might be a guest at somebody else's Seder. Can you talk a little bit about what it means to show up as yourself, but also kind of maybe protect yourself, or be in community with others where your voice is not always like you want to share your voice, but are there, I don't know, are there safeguards sometimes that you should put in?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I think about that, it means like, what does it, sharing your voice might be sharing your voice with yourself. Like, it might be like speaking your truth to yourself and owning your story and saying like, I am showing up for me and not for others. And that's what I think about through that lens of that first text from the Zohar of like our words being exiled and being slave to another person's narrative in Egypt, and then like gaining agency over our narrative. Owning our narrative might not be about how we interface externally, but more so about like how we feel internally about like, what is our story? And is that story defined by others or defined by ourselves, I would say. Yeah, it's a good question. Some of the things coming through in the chat, and I just want to appreciate the different ideas that are putting down here. But talking about social justice issues, looking at how we give thanks, where do we speak up, asking those questions of others. Some good ideas in the chat, so thank you. I'll let everyone read through those themselves.
Thank you so much, Jory. I'm kind of just stuck in the chat here and reading all the ideas. They're so beautiful. And thank you so much for bringing your own gorgeous perspective to this. Really, really grateful. Okay, and we will come back at the end to talk a little bit more about all of this. But I'm so happy now to introduce Rabbi Sarah Bassin from HIAS. Rabbi Sarah's bio is in the chat. Oh, it is in the chat. Okay, great. She's the Director of Clergy and Congregations at HIAS. And I also want to tell you that her family has a delicious cheesecake recipe with a macaroon crust that she is very fond of. So Rabbi Sarah joined us at HerTorah when we were talking about immigration, and we are so happy to have you back to teach us about freedom. I was thinking that often, if you have a Disney movie, there's this great redemption, and then it's over. Or you have the Haggadah even, and we tell the story of our leaving Egypt, then it's over. It doesn't get into the hard work of what you do when you are free. And we're so happy that you are here with us to kind of talk to us about what are the responsibilities of freedom. What do we have to do in order to be worthy of that gift?
Thank you. That's exactly where we're going to pick up tonight. And, just a note about my experience with this space and this group, having been a relative newcomer, is that one of the things I appreciate so much about it is the diversity of backgrounds and experiences that people come from. I come from a family where our Seder was 30 minutes, and that was a long Seder. And I married into a family where their Seders are 6 hours without exaggeration. And so, finding the space in between where all of us can be and function can sometimes be a challenge. But the source text that I actually cite in favor of a briefer Seder is the text within the Haggadah that we're going to dive into tonight, Halach Ma'anya. This is the bread of affliction. Because this is the Haggadah within the Haggadah, right? This is a one paragraph synopsis of what the entire experience that we are sitting down to do and to achieve is all about. Of now that we are free, what is it that we are choosing to do with this freedom? So I'm going to pull up the highest Haggadah inserts, or the kind of accompaniment that you can do for your regular Haggadah. If we can also put that in the chat. You are welcome to use this at your Seder. It's free for download. I want to recognize it is part of an explosion of beautiful Haggadot and Haggadot editions that people are now using at their Seders. Obviously, HIAS, as the Jewish organization serving all refugees, the lens that it's bringing is about connecting the stories of refugees and displaced people today, and connecting that to our ancient narrative as refugees. So give me just one moment to share the text here. Okay, so Halach Ma'anya, Di'achalu Abhatana Ba'ar'a Demitzrayim. This is the bread of affliction, the poor bread that our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. Kol dichvin yetei v'yachol, kol ditrich yetei v'yipsach. Let all who are hungry come and eat, and all who are in need come and celebrate Passover with us. I'm going to hold off on the second part of that, but this, I think, is the most beautiful and short encapsulation of what it is that we are sitting down to do at the actual Seder. So HIAS's Haggadah, that is pulled up here, there's a text that it connects the Halach Ma'anya, and it's the text of the story of a recently settled Afghan family here in the United States in St. Louis, and a family that was resettled by 3 different congregations, one Muslim, one Jewish, one Christian. I'm going to have, if you don't mind, my co-presenters take paragraphs so you're not only hearing my voice while doing this, for us to read that text out loud. And as we're reading it, to think about what are the connections with the original text. What are the connections with this is the bread of affliction, the poor bread that our ancestors ate in Israel. Let all who are hungry come and eat. Let all who are in need come and celebrate Passover with us. So, Jory, if you don't mind, would you be willing to take that first paragraph, and then Aliza the second?
Absolutely. When Anissa and her family arrived in St. Louis in February after fleeing Afghanistan, she was nervous and unsure what to expect. Now, she says that living in her new home is like magic, with volunteers from a local interfaith group providing for the family's needs, including supporting their observance of Ramadan.
Yeah, keep going.
Oh, okay. The Intertwined Interfaith Welcome Circle, a coalition of Congregation Shrey Emet Parkway United Church of Christ and Turkish American Society of Missouri, supported Anissa and her family by providing food and rides to local mosques throughout the month. They also organized a communal iftar, a meal eaten during Ramadan to break the day's fast after sundown.
All right, Aliza, jump in.
Ali Durhan, a Welcome Circle member who also volunteers as Taysam's outreach coordinator, was the first to suggest that the three organizations collaborate on a communal iftar. The event was hosted at Shari Emet, with Taysam families providing traditional Turkish food and Anissa's family and other Afghan families in attendance. Keep going.
Mm-hmm.
Coming from a different culture, they may have a lot of question marks about non-Muslims, why they are helping us, said Durham. Because they never had in-person, first-hand experience. I believe that hosting an iftar and praying in a synagogue, it means a lot to the families and shows how welcoming they are that they open their holy space to us to pray.
Anissa's family enjoyed the event immensely. They especially appreciated the opportunity to meet with other Afghan families living in the area. We felt really good, like we had not lost our family in Afghanistan, said Anissa. Okay. Beautiful, powerful, fine. Let's talk about just your reactions and if you see any ties between the text that we read about these three congregations creating a space for Ramadan, for iftar, for these Afghan families. What are the connections and what are the disconnects with Halach Ma'anya about let all who are hungry come and eat, let all who are in need come and celebrate Passover? See a lot of curiosity and interest for folks wanting to attend iftars themselves. It is a beautiful experience. So the one thing I really want to lift out is there's this invitation in Halach Ma'anya of let all who are hungry come to our Seder, right? Food, yes, is essential to the experience. But in this particular situation, it's not about inviting people to come to the Seder. It's about creating a space for others to carry out their ritual, right? It's about let all who are hungry come to this iftar. And I'm curious if that feels like it fulfills the directive of Halach Ma'anya. Is this meeting what the text is telling us to try to do? Or is it falling short in some way? Is the ritual of the Seder the necessary component? Beautiful. Joan's congregation hosted an iftar, kind of showing the hospitality that's possible. Oh, Deborah, that's nice. Let all who are hungry come and feed their spirits, right? So it's not just the actual physical nourishment, that there needs to be consideration of people's spiritual nourishment when they are expressing that value. Hungry and needy, which are not the same. You can be needy for something else. Beautiful. Aliza, they don't have to give up their own rituals in order to be welcomed into our homes. I think that that's really an important piece of this. And there's part of me that wrestles with, when you look at the text of Halach Ma'anya, what is actually the central directive? Is it put on a Passover Seder? Or is it let all who are hungry come and eat, right? Is the ritual the end? And the byproduct of that ritual happens to be that people who are hungry can come and eat? Or is the ritual the means to the end of actually creating the space for people to have their needs met? And for me, this is a larger metaphor about how we show up in acts of chesed. Are we showing up because we are meeting a need for ourselves, right? There's some kind of either spiritual or ritualistic need that we are fulfilling for ourselves. Or are we doing this chesed, this loving kindness? Thank you, Ariel. Are we doing this chesed as a way to meet and attend to the needs of the beneficiary, whoever that might be? And when you look back at the text with the highest Haggadah, right, it really seems to have a clear viewpoint on what the purpose of Halach Ma'anya is. That it is actually not that the ritual is the end in and of itself, right? Susan, I take your point that they don't need to be mutually exclusive. 100%, they can be kind of mutually reinforcing rather than mutually exclusive. And I do think that it's important to understand, as the art of the gathering indicates, like, what is the purpose of this thing that we are attending to? And if you look back at that text, you can kind of see some of the hesitation of the family built in, right? Some of the traumas that were showing through for them, and they're adapting to their new life and their new reality, that they were really unsure of what it was to trust this group to do the resettlement. So when Highest trains volunteers, a big part of the focus is around building a sensitivity about the experience and the traumas that people are coming in with, and what we need to think about more clearly in responding to those needs and to those traumas. So I just want to name a few of the things that Highest kind of does, like this humility training for the volunteers that it brings to light, and just see how these resonate for you, or if there are things that you think might be interesting to reflect on in your own acts of chesed, of loving kindness, or in your own social justice work. So in addition to that need to build trust, right, that actually came out of a place of real fear for this family of fleeing Afghanistan. They were legitimately worried and expressed a concern that they didn't understand why this group halfway across the world, made up of Christians and Jews as well as Muslims, would want to help them. And they feared that this was perhaps a human trafficking group, a group of people that wanted to do them harm. So there was a need for this group to prove themselves to the Afghans that they could be trusted, right? To kind of build that foundation of trust, that it couldn't just be assumed. It is hard to hear. Another thing I think that the text reflects is it acknowledges the cultural overwhelm that these families must be feeling. A lot of times when congregations do the work of resettling refugees, coming from a very beautiful place of good intention, they want to invite them into the community to celebrate Shabbat with them or to come to the Seder. But there's also a need to acknowledge that literally everything for these families is new. Everything from the language to the public transportation to having to find a new job and probably professional identity as aspects of their career might not translate, the school system, the bureaucracy, the way that the water faucets and the toilets work, everything is new and overwhelming. So to just invite somebody into your space, it could be just another new and overwhelming thing. So this idea of creating or trying to replicate or tap into something familiar to them is really a sign of kavod, a sign of respect to these families, that there are pieces of themselves that they can bring and that they don't have to leave behind. Another part of the sensitivity training that we really try to attune people to is the need for privacy. Again, coming from a really beautiful place of like wanting to share the good work that's being done, sometimes congregations will want to publicize the stories of the families that they're helping, or pictures of the children enjoying the new home, whatever it is. There's also a need to balance the emotional health of those families, right? Are they in a place where they're comfortable of other people knowing about the traumas and what they fled and what they experienced? Do they want their children's pictures out in the world associated with these projects for, all eternity? A lot of us are conscious, if we have children, of those privacy concerns for them and what it means to put that out into the world, maybe in a time when they're not yet able to consent. And then the final thing that I'll say that we really try to attune people to in terms of our sense of responsibility and focusing on their experience rather than our need to do the good, is that yes doesn't always mean yes. That there's a power dynamic in the relationship between the sponsor and the beneficiary, where if the sponsor asks the beneficiary to do something, would you come to this funder and share your story? Would you be willing to make this dish for other people to show them the culture, right? The beneficiary wants to say yes because they feel so deeply grateful and indebted to the sponsor that the power imbalance makes it difficult for them to say no. So part of what we encourage volunteers to do is to be really thoughtful about the asks that we're making. So if this text seemed really like a simple synopsis at the beginning, right? Let all who are hungry come and eat. It's actually not that simple of a directive, because in order for it to be done well and in order for it to be done right, it requires so much deep and intentional thinking to make sure that that invitation not only comes across as real and genuine, but that it serves a healing purpose in addition to meeting the very fundamental Maslow hierarchy of needs that family as well. But lest this teaching be only about the well-being of the other, I think it's worthwhile to wind down by looking at the second half of the text that I made us ignore at the beginning. Okay. All right, so, right, we stopped at the place where it said, let all who are hungry come and eat, let all who are in need come and celebrate Passover with us. This year here, next year in Israel. This year we are slaves, next year we will be free. Okay, so what's the connection between part 1 and part 2 of the text? What does let all who are hungry come and eat have to do with this year here for us, next year in Israel, this year slaves, next year free? What connection would you make between those two pieces of the text? I'll offer that I think I understand that I'm asking questions that are pretty entailed and hard to, kind of just put little pieces out. There we go. The hope of moving forward. What's the connection between the first half of Halach Ma'anya and the second half? The Exodus is basically a story of hope for the future. All right, Eve, while there are people who are hungry, none of us are free. That's what I think it is. I think that this text is perhaps the most ancient incarnation of that idea that while if all of us are not free, then none of us is free. And that our salvation, our freedom is linked to that first half of the text. When there are no more hungry people, right? That is the point at which we will stop saying this year here, next year in Jerusalem. This year we are slaves, next year we will be free, right? That when everybody is able to celebrate and have that same experience of freedom, then there is no more need to say that we are in exile or that we are slaves. And I just want to end on kind of a hopeful note moving forward. This particular family, the story that was shared in the Haggadah, Hayas actually made like a 6-minute video about the welcome circle that helps them resettle, and about their experience here. If we could put that in the chat. You cannot watch this and walk away with a dry eye. I swear to you, I've watched it like 13 times, and every single time I get goosebumps and I start tearing up. And the most powerful piece of this video, spoiler alert, I'm going to ruin it, is the fact that there's an Afghan boy who's part of this family that was being resettled. And a few months after his family landed and started this whole process of rebuilding their lives, a Ukrainian family that was also displaced and had to pick up their lives and moved in across the street. And that little boy went over to that family, and the little boy that was part of the Ukrainian family, and he walked him to the bus stop on the first day of school. I can't help myself right now. And he walked him through the first day of class and the first day of school, understanding the overwhelm that boy was experiencing from a very real place. And that is what I think the Haggadah is trying to get us to understand. Like, that is what it is to remember that you were strangers, right, in the land of Egypt, and that you must be kind to the stranger. That is the action. That is what ha-lachma anya. This is the bread of afflictions that our ancestors ate. Let all who are hungry come and eat. That is the message of what the Haggadah is trying to tell us and the world that we are trying to create.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Sarah. You took us so deep that like all the ideas that I had for incorporating something about refugees into my Seder now seem like you really don't hit the mark, like that they're too surface and don't really get to what you were saying. So I wonder if we really want to include these ideas in our Seder in a way that feels real to you. Can you help us think about what we might be able to do?
Yeah, I think that with a lot of social justice themed Seders, the place where we kind of get ourselves to, but we stop at, is the place of what can I do, right? We like do the brainstorming of the actions that we can take, or and rightfully so, we celebrate the actions that we are involved in and that we are taking. And I think the invitation that this text is presenting, and like this whole lens is presenting, is to ask the next question, right? Is that, how is that action received by the beneficiary? To think about our acts of chesed, of loving kindness, to think about our volunteer efforts, and not just think about the good that they're doing and what they do for us, but to really try to process through and imagine, what are all of the wonderful and perhaps potentially problematic ways in which our actions land with people who are the beneficiaries? And not that should stop us from doing these actions by any means, but simply to be able to integrate that, right, as really important and useful data in shaping how we go about those actions in the future.
Yes, thank you so much. I was also thinking, and I wonder what you think about this, based on the Art of Gathering. She says that the gathering doesn't start when you get to the table. The gathering starts with invitation and with the preparation. And I was wondering, like, maybe a good thing to do with the people at my Seder table would be to do some sort of volunteer something before the Seder and then reflect on it, on the real, and like what really happened there at the Seder, instead of using the Seder as kind of like my get up and go and then just never following up on it.
I think that's really beautiful, right? And I would imagine it's going to be a vulnerable space to talk about, both the experiences of discomfort, maybe that volunteering brought, and also, to be honest, in those reflections of what was about you versus what was about them. But if you're able to achieve it, what a beautiful space and a good reason to gather would be.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you really to all our teachers who have really opened up the idea of freedom and what we're doing at the Seder. I'm so grateful to you. I want to take the time now for all of us to kind of brainstorm together. We've heard lots and lots of beautiful ideas, and I hope maybe you had a pen and you were jotting down a few things. Put in the chat, please, take a few minutes and think, and then put in the chat and I'll tell you the two questions I'm going to ask. The first question is, what was something that you want to take with you, a teaching or a learning that you want to take with you from tonight? That's going to be the first question I'm going to ask you. And the second question is going to be, how are you going to bring that to your Seder, right? Because those are two different questions. The first is, what is something that really moved you, really spoke to you tonight? And the second is, how are you going to bring that to your Seder? Okay, so I'm going to invite you first to just answer the first question. What is something that you learned tonight that moved you, that you want to take with you? I'm going to let people keep writing. I'll just read through some of them. None of us are free until all of us are free. The power of story. We aren't free until we all are free from hunger. The power of collaboration. The idea of possibilities in the future that seem currently impossible. Imagining what could be different in the coming year. The open heart of action. The bit about Nachshon. Bringing our own freedom. In Mitzrayim, in Egypt, we had no voice, no story. In the wilderness, we begin to find our voice, agency, and self-liberation. The invitation into vulnerability and discomfort for the sake of richness and growth. Embracing the role I play in obtaining freedom. The power of agency to wellness. The connection between the Hebrew words for wilderness and speak is going to stay with me among so much other beauty from tonight and will impact my writing and teaching. The idea to think about how chesed, loving kindness, is received by the beneficiaries. Never thought about that before. How to be even more understanding of others. How to use my agency for the good. The centrality of the concept of agency underlying mental health in general. That we should help anyone who needs help. What is the best way to help others? How do we help people to help themselves? The importance and challenge and vulnerability of honesty. Freedom is the power to imagine things that can be different. Freedom of choice in who and when, and what and where and why in storytelling, and giving others that freedom. Oh, Harriet's answering both at once. My Seder will be small, just my husband and my son and his family, a toddler and a baby. I think I'll tell the story about the two children from Afghanistan and Ukraine. My granddaughter will understand it. About the journey we take in this life and the journeys of our ancestors. Action requires action. The importance of being able to jump in to find one's way. Okay, ask at the Seder, how are you enslaved? How can you be free? How can you help others be free? Historic memory of suffering must serve to generate empathy. Thank you, those are all such beautiful answers. Okay, so now we've got to switch our heads from what did we learn to how do we want to give it over at the Seder, right? In whatever context that you're going to be in, if you're going to be with a family, your own family or another, if you're going to be with friends, if you're going to have a small Seder. If you are not going to have a Seder and you'd like to have a Seder, contact Ariella and me, and we would love to set you up with somebody in this community. So what will you do? How are you going to bring these ideas into the Seder?
I have to go, guys. So can I just say what I wrote?
Sure, Laura, go ahead.
I wrote my family is some of my brother and niece are going to Spain, and I'm going to Florida with my nephew and sister-in-law. My mom and dad and I and sister-in-law and nephew will be there for Passover. We have a little baby that we're going to play with and then go to Chicago.
That sounds
For,
good, Laura. Enjoy.
for-
Have a wonderful time.
Yeah, and Sarah, thank you for doing this, and everybody else. I'm not a big fan of Passover, but it's an okay holiday.
Thank you, Laura. I'm going to read some of the answers here. Ask good questions and listen to the answers. Brainstorm as a family how we on a personal level can free ourselves, what's holding us back, and how we can use that to free others. I'm going to bring this up with my in-laws. Tie the questions to the symbols of Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. I think I'm going to ask everybody at my Seder about a time in their life when they felt free. Invite people to share Nachshon moments. I'm bringing my Miriam's cup to my congregational Seder and share how Miriam's voice is no longer silenced. I love all these ideas. And I love how what we're doing here is creating agency, right? We have these beautiful ideas that we received, and now we are using them. Find a Seder where I can be free to create a healthy family of choice. Amen, Jessica. Amen. Everybody knows the biggest thing that came out of tonight were the jalapeno pepper marors. Actually, definitely. Okay, thank you everybody for being here. Thank you to our wonderful teachers for sharing your wisdom with us. Thank you to everybody who participated in the chat for sharing your wisdom with us. Thank you to our sponsors. So nice to see Sarah Poland here. But we want your Supergirl again. We want to be in person and have your soup and your salads.
Can we ask Sarah actually, because I'm going to shout her out in a nanosecond. Sarah, can you please tell us what's one of your family table Seder traditional fabulousness? Because other than like recommending all of the soups that are around the table, I can only imagine that you're, hold on. While you're thinking, I'm going to talk about you for a second and interrupt Aliza. I want to shout out Supergirl and Sarah Poland because she is the founder of the amazing Supergirl that makes the most delicious soups and salads. And it's so full circle. Sarah supplied the deliciousness at our very first HerTorah and many subsequent ones. And in addition to missing humans, that was definitely one of the things that I missed from not being in person. But one of the biggest things that I love about Sarah and Supergirl is that everything that goes into her soup adheres to their mission of equity and compassion, from their ingredients to their workers to where they source and sell their products. Plus they ship all over the country, and their deadline for ordering for Passover is not until Monday. And I am here to verify 1000% that it is delicious. So you're going to have the link to that. And Sarah, I would love to know what some funky, fabulous Poland tradition is at your Seder. And I want to find you and spotlight you.
Oh no, don't spotlight me. No.
Fine, just your voice. We'll listen to your voice.
I would just say thank you. This was incredible. I'm blown away. I have so many notes. So thank you, and for that kind. I'm overwhelmed. The deadline to order isn't until a week from Friday, so don't worry. March 31st. But a tradition that we've started is, to be honest, now that they can speak, now they're older, is really listen to the young ones, because they used to say the cute and adorable things that everyone would laugh at, and with each passing year, they add, I think, in a way, more wisdom than the adults, because they have no filter. And they're learning, right now, I'm very blessed. My nieces are in Jewish day school. And so they learn and they synthesize and they share with no shame and with no edit and with no knowledge of maybe I shouldn't say this. And I think that I hope to take these notes and challenge them at the Seder, because I can only imagine what they're going to say. This was really wonderful. So I'm looking forward to creating new traditions with everything I learned tonight. So thank you all. Thank you. Thank you.
I love it. Thank you so much, Sarah. I will personally verify that anything chunky on your menu is definitely a fan fave in my house. Thank you for being here and for the beautiful work that you do. You can taste the goodwill that goes into everything that you make. I want to thank also our amazing educators. Thank you so, so much. And to everybody in the chat, like it was so fantastic. And I'm, again, just taking all of you with me and all of your stories and insights. Thank you to Highest. I will send the link to their Haggadah so that everybody has it, and the links that Rabbi Sarah shared to Bamidbar Therapy. Just knowing that you exist, Jory, is just, I'm just so glad to know that you are out there doing the work that you are doing. And the word Bamidbar now has a different meaning for me. And thank you for doing your work and showing up in that way. Rabbi Shani, thank you for braving all of your plagues and having a precursor to them, and coming here and sharing your work and sharing Pardes with us. And there are so many opportunities to learn with Rabba Shani and so many of her colleagues. So definitely check out Pardes. All those links will be coming your way. Thank you to Steph for her fantastic support behind the scenes, making tonight such a pleasure.